Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the Southwest Climate Podcast. My name is Gigi Owen, and I'm here with my colleague, Christina Green. Do you want to say hello, Christina?
Hi, everyone.
Christina and I run the Environment and Society Fellowship Program here at the University of Arizona. It's part of the Climate Assessment for the Southwest Research Group. And today we've taken over this episode to highlight some community-engaged environmental research that's happening here at the university. This research was supported over the past year by our fellowship program, which was created to support graduate students who are conducting use-inspired environmental research and science communication. The fellowship really tries to bring together students from across disciplines whose work connects environmental challenges with real-world decision-making and community needs. So each year, fellows develop collaborative projects that address pressing environmental and societal issues, including climate adaptation, food safety, environmental justice, and wildfire resilience. And what makes this program unique is its emphasis on partnership and communication and research that's really grounded in experiences and priorities of communities. So today we're going to hear directly from our current Environment and Society Fellows about their research, the communities they work with, and the questions that are driving their projects. I'll do a short introduction and then we'll hear more directly from the fellows. So Lois Polashensky is a doctoral student in environmental science whose work focuses on environmental health, pollution exposure, and community-engaged research. Her fellowship project centers on garden roots in Cottonwood, Arizona, where she works alongside community members to investigate environmental exposures associated with historic copper smelting operations. Welcome to the show, Lois.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Next up, we have Alyssa Rosenbaum, who is also a PhD student in environmental science, studying fresh produce, food safety, and agriculture water quality. Working at the intersection of agriculture, food systems, and public health, her project supports growers navigating updated Food Safety Modernization Act regulations related to pre-harvest agricultural water assessments. Welcome to the show, Alyssa.
Thank you. I'm excited to do this podcast.
And finally, we have Andrea Stig, who is a doctoral student in sociocultural anthropology, whose fellowship project explores relationships between fire, land stewardship, and communities in Northern California and the Bay Area. Through ethnographic research and engagement with people working directly with prescribed fire and wildfire response, Andrea examines how cultural knowledge, lived experience, and environmental change shape approaches to fire management and resilience. We're excited to learn more about what you've been up to, Andrea.
Thanks. I'm excited to talk with everyone today.
So first, let's hear more from each of you to provide a richer description of your work. So really, what have you been up to? Where have you been? Who have you been working with over the past year? And Andrea, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so as a sociocultural anthropology student, my dissertation research, as you said, is about fire in the US West, both wildfire and intentionally set fires. So there are, as many of us know, whole networks of agencies, but also private groups that participate in, first of all, suppressing wildfires at every scale, and second, using what's called controlled burning to decrease the amount of flammable material on the ground on lands or serve other ecological purposes. So many of these agencies and groups share some big goals like reducing the frequency and severity of catastrophic wildfires, preventing those wildfires that burn down communities, lead to people's deaths, replace whole forest ecosystems, for instance. But beyond that, a lot of the priorities and tactics between groups can be different. There can even be conflicting priorities and tactics between organizations or between different arms of a single organization, because there's just a whole set of evolving science and, moreover, evolving social priorities on the role that fire should have in our lands and in our communities. So I have been spending the past year looking at these systems, especially in Oregon and most especially in California's Bay Area. In Oregon, I was working with an agency that does fire suppression and seeing how the mandates of serving those communities led to really suppression of fire. By suppression of fire, I mean, putting out of every small fire, because the resources on those lands were considered vulnerable, and the ask of those agencies was to prevent anything becoming a wildfire. I've also worked with groups on the community scale in California's Bay Area that are working to use fire intentionally in wildlands in order to both prevent huge catastrophic wildfires later and to also meet a lot of ecological goals like controlling for invasive species and encouraging the growth of other species. So specifically in my research for CLIMAS, I work closely with a Bay Area-based group called the Good Fire Alliance. They're a community organized prescribed burn association, and they're formed of people who practice ecological stewardship by selectively burning vegetation.
That's so interesting. And you were doing some trainings yourself, like you were learning how to do prescribed burns, is that right?
Yeah. So I started out just going to burns that anyone was invited to. There were just a few requirements about the safety gear that was a baseline for everyone to have, and they were really inviting. The idea is that prescribed burning in places like Northern California, well, I guess I should say more generally, intentionally using fire has been a land management tool in Northern California practiced by Indigenous people since time immemorial. So within some of the Native nations who have carried that work forward, the expectation is that land is available to be burned and that fire is a safe tool to be used by people of all ages, backgrounds, and some of the groups that I work with in the Bay Area of California, although not solely composed of Native members, they have a lot of non-Native members too. These groups are working to make good fire a practice that a lot of people can do. So I started out going to these public burns, and then in order to be able to do some of the more intensive burning that has become complicated because of how much fuel has built up on the landscape, it became necessary to do more intensive training. And so I did basic training on becoming a wildland firefighter. And so now I'm a certified wildland firefighter, and used used that certification to actually work on an engine crew, and have been accompanying people in my community to additional wildland fire and prescribed fire training in order to see what their experience and my shared experience with them is, taking these trainings to become more qualified.
It's so fascinating. Excited to learn more. I want to go to Alyssa and have you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been up to this past year.
Yeah, so mentioned in the introduction, all of my research and focus is really on public health and fresh produce food safety. And specifically tying into that, I focused on the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule, which is a rule or a regulation we have in the US that fresh produce growers must follow. And that's mandated by the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. So this regulation is really focused on giving food safety practices that growers must follow to protect our public health and to reduce foodborne illness. So really, so that we're all safe and we don't become ill when we consume the fresh produce. This rule has been around since 2015, but just in 2024, the FDA implemented some revisions to these requirements, and they specifically revolve around water. So historically, a grower used to be able to go out into their operation, collect a sample of their water. So say they're using pond for irrigation. They could take that sample, send it to a third-party laboratory, and that lab would send them back results based on generic E. coli or bacteria that's in that water. They could take the levels that that laboratory tells them, and they could go back to the produce safety rule and say, yes, I'm meeting the threshold that the FDA set, or no, I'm not, and I need to make some changes. Well, in these updates, these growers now conduct what's called a pre-harvest agricultural water assessment. And in this assessment, they now go out into their operation, and instead of taking just a water test and shipping it off, they now have to consider many different factors, things such as what water source they're using, how is it being distributed to the field, what different crop characteristics and environmental conditions are going on. So instead of now kind of that checklist, yes or no, I'm meeting the requirements, they now have that assessment to think of many different factors. So it's really shifting mindsets, requires new skills that people may have not used related to water, critical thinking. And so we really wanted to try to help in this area as it's shifting mindsets. So when a grower goes out and they conduct that assessment, they're looking for different food safety hazards. So they're looking for things that may cause illness like E. coli or salmonella. If they identify any places where those hazards could potentially make its way into the system, they have to implement different practices or what we call mitigation measures to try to reduce any risk that could occur. Those mitigation measures do have to be supported by science, which adds another layer of complexity because unfortunately, we don't have science in all the areas that an assessment focuses on. So that's really what drove my research and why we decided to focus on the produce safety rule and water. I'm trying to fill some of those gaps. To give a little bit more detail on what my field research actually looked like, we were trying to fill some of the gaps related to final water application and harvest. So this is one of those mitigation measures I mentioned a grower could use. We know as you extend that application of water and harvest, that different conditions such as UV radiation or temperature, and even just time can allow bacteria like that E. coli to die off. But unfortunately, again, going back to those gaps in science, there's not a lot of exact science to say how long a grower should wait. What's an acceptable time to have for that final water application or harvest? And so we wanted to do some field trials. We specifically worked with romaine lettuce, which is a really large commodity here in Arizona, as well as lemons, which citrus is also another commodity that has significance in the state. We were able to go out and replicate what a contaminated water application would look like. So we take water and we mix it with bacteria. We spray it on that fresh produce and collect it over time to try to help and provide some of those time recommendations for a grower. So a lot of this research, I really got to connect with growers in the Yuma, Arizona area, which is our really large production area in the U.S. It's actually termed the winter leafy green capital of the U.S. So I got to work directly with some of those growers that are right in the middle of it, conducting these assessments and providing fresh produce to the U.S.
So neat that you were able to go out in the field and really hear from farmers, like how are they dealing with this new policy, and like how does that really affect their growing. I also want to turn to Lois, and if you'll tell us a little bit about your research.
Of course. It's really funny that one of the five C's of Arizona, so like the five economic pillars was mentioned, one of them is citrus. I work with a different one of the five C's. I work with copper. So my research focuses primarily a lot on copper. Copper mining is really a common history across the entire state of Arizona. Like I said, is one of those foundational pillars. The community that I worked with, Cottonwood, Arizona, is definitely no stranger to that history. It was home to a copper smelter for a regional mining operation that happened in the neighboring Jerome, Arizona. And what essentially happened was after you smell all of the ore for the copper that you want, you get left with a solid byproduct, which is called slag. In this case, we refer to it as copper slag since they were primarily smelting the ore for copper. And Cottonwood as a community kind of grew around that slag pile. If you pull up a nice Google Maps picture of Cottonwood, you'll see this giant black dot that sits quite literally directly in their town. And that is the remnants of that history of copper smelting. the pile kind of sat idle for a while. In 2015, a company came in and started repurposing that slag, and so they're doing a process where they're blasting the pile since it's a very solid pile, and then crushing it down to different size fractions and selling those both within the state and nationally and even globally in some cases. And the community kind of had a little bit of concern as to what that was doing to their environment and potentially their health. And so my research for my dissertation, part of my dissertation research, kind of focuses on two really overarching questions, one of which is what is actually in this copper slag? And the second is how is it impacting this community of Cottonwood, Arizona? And that second question is what my fellowship research kind of focused on. So over the past year, we've actually made a lot of good progress. The community members have been trained and collected their samples. They did dust, soil, and they set up air monitors, and that occurred last May through July. Our lab has received all those samples back. We did a trip up to collect them and have analyzed those samples for metalloid concentrations, so things like copper, but also things that we may be more concerned about, like arsenic and lead. And then those results have been reported back to the community in what we call a community first report back model. So the community members are the first to get their results back prior to it going through something like peer review, which is part of the academic process. And we've started collecting an additional set of samples that will be part of the project. And we'll repeat that sort of ongoing process as we move along. So that's kind of what I've been up to in the last year.
Super interesting. Thank you. I think the three of you have engaged with very different community partners in your research. And I'm really curious to hear what drew you to do community engaged research.
I think for me, one of the things is growing up. I grew up in a heavily mining polluted area. I grew up in Northeast Pennsylvania where coal mining was like a really big deal. And so I think from my perspective, I'm so used to seeing how community members are the people to gather around and rally around these sort of like changes that occur within your community and really be like the first people on scene advocating for something. And so I think for me personally, coming from that background and knowing what that's like, I wanted to continue that in the future. I had a lot of questions when I was a child and I saw those things going on. And so now as an adult doing research, those are sort of the things that I keep in the back of my brain as I do this work. So yeah, I think for me that's why I do community engaged work specifically.
Yeah, as a graduate student, you get to see. I had a different advisor for my master's and my PhD, so I've gotten little bits of different experience to come together. And I've really seen in different aspects how scientific research can not always relate back to the community. And in those ways, it doesn't really have that strong impact. So I think as soon as you start to experience and getting to see how research can have that community impact, it's really hard to go backwards and do research that doesn't. So I started to see throughout just the process of graduate school, how scientific research can happen, kind of get put on a shelf or just be created for a publication aspect. And I learned that I really wanted to go a different route and be able to have that community aspect where you get to work directly with the people that you're trying to impact. And you actually do get to see that impact, especially in something as important as public health, making sure that we're all safe when we consume fresh produce.
I've been connected to community organizations since longer than I've been in grad school. And so, kind of before I even knew I wanted to go to grad school, I knew that that was going to be a big feature of my life. It meant that joining the University of Arizona School of Anthropology was a good fit because in our department, ethics and community engagement, I think, are taught at every level and ingrained in every form of operations. So I'm thankful that I've had mentors in anthropology that have made community engagement a no-brainer. And in fact, as I've become more deeply involved in community prescribed burning, I felt really comforted that the School of Anthropology and programs like CLIMAS would support research being guided by local needs as opposed to the alternative.
I actually have a question
Yeah.
on that because I think one thing for me that I think might relate to that a little bit is this sort of shift of how you see like community and in community engaged work from like prior to being in grad school, like prior to the research experience to like the now doing it as research and trying to make sure that like people's needs are centered. So I don't know if you have any experience on what that shift for you was like, because I know for me it was definitely something that I experienced.
Was the challenge for you, Lois, that you needed to figure out how to fit community engagement into research and make sure that you were still doing something rigorous?
Yeah, and I think the other challenge for me was the shift between being like remembering that I am a community member and having that be at like the forefront prior to doing the research to now being the researcher trying to like center community voices. It's not like a disconnect, but it definitely like it takes some adjusting to get used to. So,
It feels amorphous. I definitely feel that. There will be many, yeah, in my daily life, I sometimes, especially when I'm not actively collecting data, it's kind of a question how I introduce myself to people at a given day or a given event because I do feel that I'm oftentimes showing up as a member of the Good Fire community, not necessarily showing up that day as a grad researcher. So I feel that.
I think one thing that we often talk about CLIMAS is that by doing a community engaged research, it really changes not only you have a direct line with having a societal impact, but it changes the nature of the research itself. And I'm kind of opening up to anyone who wants to answer this, but how has your research changed because you've been speaking with, let's say, the community members in Arizona or farmers or people who are involved in prescribed burns?
I think for me, it really focuses on the output, thinking about how you're actually going to share those findings to your communities and making sure that they understand what the findings are and that it's put in a useful format. When, as a graduate student too, I think it's often focused on you're creating this project, you're going to write it up and you're going to put it in your dissertation. And then it's kind of time to move on to the next thing. But really thinking about that it's not just a paper, that it means something to people and finding a way to make sure that it's usable. And that's been something that I've really been thinking about a lot lately is that, specifically related to my project, my research is used as scientific justification for growers, but I don't want it to just be a paper that they pull off the internet and say, here you go, this paper says this thing, so I'm going to do this. I want it to be applicable and that they understand and that it really is useful to them.
How do you kind of make sure that's happening?
I think that it's a lot harder said than done. Like you can say, turn this into output that's usable, but I think it's involving those community members and constantly having the cycle of going to them and saying, so we've done this research. And even before you do the research, going to them and saying, this is the research we are going to be doing. This is kind of what it's going to look like. What do you all think? Does this seem applicable? Are we mimicking real world conditions and kind of putting them in there? Then coming back after you conduct that work and saying, okay, now we have this information. What are ways that we can make it useful to you? And just really involving them in the conversations. And I think that's where I've learned the most is listening and hearing what they say because they often bring up aspects you maybe never considered because, we're researchers or academics, we're not necessarily always the ones conducting the actual work, like growers are when they're doing those assessments.
Yeah, that I really like that idea. We talk about it a lot too, this like iterativity, this like, it's not just like putting one thing out and giving it to someone and then boom, you're done. It's like that dialogue of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth that gets you to a point that you might not have even expected at the beginning of the project or known that that was going to be coming out. So that was one point I thought that came out of what you just said, and also just the idea of like listening, like that, there's this, it's not just communicating outward, but that other side of communication is that listening and active listening and just like hearing what people's needs are, responding, and then going back. Lois or Andrea, do you have kind of thoughts on that or experiences with that this past year?
yeah, I think the bidirectional communication is like a really, really big thing to kind of like nail down in a way, like get used to doing it. I think in academia and in science, You think about like the very traditional ways that we talk to people about data, and it's a lot of just talking at somebody, presentations, posters, going to these things and having this like audience that like stands around you and like listens. But when you do community engaged work, it's very different. It's about making a connection with somebody and understanding where they're coming from, and then kind of being able to have like a back and forth dialogue, so that like bi-directionalness instead of just shoveling a bunch of information on them and going, here you go, figure out what to do with this. So yeah, I think that like that iterativeness of like going back and forth is part of that too.
My work has long been with highly specialized and educated people. The my research participants, my subjects, my human subjects of my research have been extremely trained and technically proficient in their fields of expertise. When I've been yeah, for my bachelor's, master's, and now my doctoral project. So it's been kind of a funny experience with my research subjects because every group that I've worked with, I've often approached as the anthropologist asking, here's kind of what I'm seeing from being around you, but what do you think I should study? What do you think are the questions I should ask? And these highly educated groups of people have universally had extremely good ideas for what my social science research questions should be. And oftentimes it's like the task is translating people's own analyses of their work and their own analyses of the conditions in which they are operating into a form that can be used in kind of my field. So that's been a really great delight of the people that I get to work with. And it's especially fun and funny in my present work, this fire project. I've been with my research participants 5 days a week. When I was working on the fire crew, I would have long drives in an engine with my colleagues, and there would just be so many hours in which to discuss, their experience and our shared work and come up with ideas together. And similarly, working with the Prescribed Burn Association, there will be down times when we are doing ecological stewardship work together, and ideas will be kind of flowing and being generated in situ constantly all the time. And all of that has become really embedded in in kind of my research. And if anything, I'm just really, really humbled by and grateful for the extent to which my participants have, their voices and ideas and the theories that they've generated are going to be so deeply a part of any knowledge that I produce.
I mean, that what you're describing to me sounds more like you're just like in the everyday and it's almost like building that shared experience together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people have a deep knowledge of what they need, and I'm hearing that in Alyssa and Lois's conversations as well, that people are really helpful to our the generation of our work.
I really loved how you described it as a joyful process. And I think we in academia tend to really focus on, the import or, this is a problem that we're trying to solve. And it's really nice to hear this as a joyful and happy experience. I don't know if anyone else had any kind of moments in this past year that were particularly joyful.
I think for me, because I'm based out of Tucson and not based out of Northern Arizona, I think for me, I always have had a great time going up to the community. It's both fortunate and unfortunate because I'm not there all the time, so I don't get to immerse myself in the community and like their needs and concerns on the daily basis, which in a way is, limiting to my understanding of what's happening in that community. But actually going there and seeing the pile, talking to people, we have like normally set times that we'll have for meetings or events that we're having with the community for the research, but they never actually end up being that long. They normally always end up being longer because we're always normally chatting with somebody, somebody staying to like talk to us. And those like moments of interaction where like I get to travel, see everybody, talk to them, and kind of have that like direct conversations with them, I think have been the happiest for me. So,
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it really goes back to the interactions being the joyful part of the experience. Especially in my field, a lot of the work can get limited to the lab or field where it's not fields where growers are growing things. You know, it's a field that's at an agricultural station or in an academic setting. So being able to go to Yuma, Arizona, and as I mentioned, you know, they're termed the U.S. Winter Leafy Green Capital, you know, so it's getting to be immersed in that community of people who are so important to the work I'm doing. I've really valued the interactions I've gotten to experience. And while it's a big industry, it feels really small when you get in there. I was constantly running into the same growers or industry professionals and got to build connections with them, which is something I totally did not expect when I came in, not only to the CLIMAS fellowship, but into my dissertation project as a whole.
Yeah, kind of building off that idea of the unexpected. I was wondering if you all had any, and you can take this in any way you want to, but is there something that surprised you over the past year, something that you learned that surprised you, or an experience, or just, a finding, even anything that was kind of bubbled up as a something new?
I think for me, it's not necessarily like a surprise per se, but something that I didn't think I expected to necessarily struggle with. When we give people back their data in this like sort of community first report back modeling, they'll receive their data on a website. They get a code to log in and they can see their own individual data. There's also a website where everybody can see all the data. It's just de-identified, so you won't know whose data is who. But part of that process is we give them comparative values, so something to compare their data to. In some cases, we didn't have comparative data or comparative values, which was, I think, a challenge for us. We had them collect indoor and outdoor dust. We have no comparative values for indoor dust. So I have no risk-based health level screening anything to give them with that data. So and I knew this going in, I knew that they weren't there, but having people ask like, okay, well, what does this mean? It was really hard to like conceptualize how to explain that you're getting data and you can maybe view it in the lens of how does your data compare to other people, but without me doing like a full risk assessment on the data that I've been given, which may or may not come out of this work in the future, I can't give you a definite. So I'm giving them data, but how do I give them context to that data when there's nothing I can compare it to? I think was a challenge, not necessarily a surprise, but something I think I didn't expect to struggle with as much as I did. And that goes as well for comparative values that we did have. There's a lot of them. And we give people all of them so that they can compare to whatever values they think fit their lifestyle or their specific needs. So there are more conservative values, there are less conservative values, and people have to kind of like parse through and figure out which of those values more fits how they would attribute their risk. And so having to go through that process and people explaining that to people, like what each of those values mean, was a definitely a little bit of a challenge in the scope of like explaining to people these are things that you will at the end of the day, like this is a decision that's up to you. I think sometimes they expected us to come in and give them an answer, like a very concrete and definite answer, and we just couldn't do that at the community report, like first report backstage. So having to have that like intermingling and explaining to people like these are what these things mean and letting them make their own choices was definitely something that I struggled with.
Yeah, science doesn't always give us a concrete answer.
For sure.
Lois,
Andrea?
I was also wondering, when I hear about your project, I mean, the, very uneducated comparison that my mind goes to is Aaron Brockovich. And I'm just imagining, yeah, I've only seen the Hollywood movie, so I in the movie, right, Julia Roberts is trains herself to be a wonk in exposure and the effect on public health of different exposures. And so she's both a wonk and an advocate who's willing to talk with people about what they can be expecting or entitled to legally. And I was wondering how that feels for you to be part of a team of researchers who are more equipped than the average people to understand how exposures will affect their health. Like, presumably, most people don't have any training in that. And yeah, I was wondering if you feel that you have sort of struggles because there are limitations to the knowledge that you are able to generate.
Yeah, I think for me, the struggle is a lot of, well, first of all, I will say some of the community members knew way more about the harms of potential exposures than even I knew as somebody who is studying this full time because they live with it and they sit with it on the daily. And so for them, it's like something that they have to know in their words, like they have to know what this is about. And say they end up doing more intensive research into like one element or one potential contaminant than I could even do in my given day. So some of it was learning from them and finding out what they knew and then taking that back with me and kind of using that as a way to like guide how I'm talking about these things to them. But I'd say for me, I think back to what Gigi had mentioned. Sometimes science can't give us really concrete answers, and sometimes it can. There's kind of a gray line where there's like a level of uncertainty. So, like when it comes to exposures and health, we actually have like a very gray line in the understanding of how like those mechanisms work at all. There's lots of research going on all the time with people trying to understand how certain exposures contribute to certain health outcomes. And so I think it was a lot of just having to explain what uncertainty actually looks like to people and what, you know, I can say some things confidently, and even those things that have some level of confidence still might have some level of uncertainty attached to them because we don't know the inner workings or specifics. So yeah, I hope that answers that. Of
Lois, I have a question to build on top of that. In your blog, you
course.
mentioned how you got more questions than answers, throughout this whole process. And I think it's touching on the things you were just mentioning. But I just wondered how you addressed when you go into your community and you have to explain, here are the outcomes, here are the gray areas, the things we don't know, and trying to tell people, research is a cycle, like it continually
Yeah.
happens. But it's to a community of people, we're researchers, we understand that. How do you
Yeah.
broach that subject and translate that to them?
I try to explain that and this is my personal take on science. I always think the best science generates more questions. I mean, I'm sure that we, as grad students, as people who have been through academia, sometimes when you go through the process, you actually learn that you know less than you thought you did. And I think that that is kind of sometimes a science thing in general, like science very specifically, is there's always more things to be asked and more things to be questioned. And so part of the community engaged portion of the work is like making sure that you're not doing, I think what Gigi had mentioned in the beginning, where you're giving them stuff and then leaving and not coming back. Understanding that it's going to be a process. You tell them, like, okay, this is a timeline for what to expect in this section of this portion of the research. And then at the end, we always have a little slide that says the end result of this is asking and generating new questions. There will always be that case where somebody has an additional question from that work. And so I think we set that expectation from the beginning that there will be more questions that need to be answered, and more things will have to continue on. And then explaining to them also that we are a research lab. Like I'm a graduate student and this laboratory exists in a research space at a university. We're not a state certified lab. We're not a health agency. So I can't do things like dictate cleanup. I think it's just kind of the goal setting at the beginning kind of helps. But yeah, ended up with a lot more questions and a lot of really good questions. I actually ended up with a lot more questions about the first question of the research, which is like, what is in the copper slag? And then the question of, is there any way we can do like source attribution to know if like these things that we're seeing in these soils or our dusts are actually tied back? And that is a very tricky question to ask and is still very much ongoing. So setting that expectation, but just letting people have their data is important too.
Yeah, I like the idea that you said, research always builds more questions, which I think though can also be something daunting because you continually conduct research and you continually get more questions, and it's like, where is the end? But I think that's where it's important when you involve community. When you go back to them and you say, okay, we generated all these questions, but what are the important ones we need to address right now? Or what are the questions not on here that you all are facing that we need to be addressing instead? And I think that's something I really learned in my PhD work, that when you go back to the community members, that's where it really helps guide future research.
Well, going off of that, I was wondering, where does your research go next? Do you all have like some of these questions that have been generated? I mean, you know, you're finishing or working on dissertations or other things. Like, do you have kind of these next steps that have come out either for yourself or where that field needs to go?
So for this project specifically, we're working on doing a second round of sampling. This round, we're trying to capture the blasting that occurs on that pile from the company that's repurposing it. So that is sort of an ongoing thing and is kind of very dependent. The community members have all their sampling kits. It's just kind of very dependent on when the community blasts. The first question, the what is in the slag question, is data that is currently in the process of almost being there to be published. We're like a couple weeks away from like submitting it to be published. And so hopefully that will get out and have some clarity for the community members, and we'll talk about it once it's published. And then in terms of my research, it's very interesting because we were just talking about this continual questioning sort of scenario. I am so happy to have built this like relationship with this community where they know me. They have my Zoom phone if they need to call me for a question. And so I think for us, once this next round of sampling is kind of done, is just figuring out where we're at and kind of taking stock and inventory of all the things that are still concerning. But I think unfortunately the pollution landscape right now and this sort of environmental justice landscape, which is the work that I do, the funding priorities have shifted in like federal funding. So like trying to figure out how to navigate that with the work that we're doing and continue that on and to have it be like sustainable, like long-term sustainability of that area will be a challenge moving forward. But I mean, everybody in my field and I think even within the university are very keen to try to figure out ways to make it work. So,
When I work with the Good Fire Alliance and this nonprofit organization, All Hands Ecology, to conduct prescribed burns. We're working in Sonoma and Marin County, and the niche that we fill is that unlike the Forest Service, a lot of the times we are burning on land that is privately owned. So we are able to address ecological challenges that are coming up on these large parcels of privately owned land. This is a lot of the land in Sonoma and Marin County, so it kind of fills in a gap so that it's not just federal or state protected areas that are having these ecological benefits and these wildfire resilience benefits. The way that has been able to take place is a series of legislative initiatives or pieces of legislation over the past few years. Prior to this, it was almost inconceivable to conduct prescribed burns on pieces of land as community members because just the liability on the very, very off chance that something went wrong and fire escaped from, the designated box, the liability facing the landowners or the people who conducted that burn would be so enormous that it would put individuals into financial ruin. And that was, a huge hurdle to being able to get fire on the ground in the first place. So over the past few years, California had a set of laws that were put into place that did things like enable people to become to have this kind of certification as a burn boss, which would qualify as the people burning having done their due diligence. Having done their due diligence, they would no longer be as likely to run into legal trouble from the state for anything that took place on the burns. And California also developed a claims fund that responsible burn bosses could access to prevent against liability for private lawsuits or something like that. So these pieces of legislation really made it financially conceivable for burning to take place. And as I understand it, the state level claims fund kind of which is kind of like state insurance for prescribed burns, is a trial run for the private insurance network, which does not, at the moment, have enough data and enough grounding to see controlled burning as a market for its insuring practices. So I think kind of a front line of good fire at the moment that a lot of my partners are seeing right now is just this like progressing forward of legal and financial possibility that still leaves a lot to be desired, and that a lot of people are working right now to adapt as we're gaining new data and new information about the success and possibility of prescribed burning. The piece that I want to research for my own research is the not only the economic safety of prescribed burning, but also the economic benefits to landowners for maintaining their land using ecologically sound practices of burning. Because if landowners are using fire on their land, they are, providing ecological services. They are also helping prevent against catastrophic change to their land. So the next frontier of my research is speaking with people who have control over land as managers or as owners, and trying to develop an analysis of the economic benefits of good fire and what they are seeing as their needs and their limitations in carrying it out.
I have a question for you. As someone, who's not from the West, where wildfires and prescribed burning are of significance, you clearly have passion and experience in the area. How did you get into this area? Because it is kind of a niche, something that I didn't really consider until I moved to Arizona.
It's yeah, I think for people not in it, it feels like a niche, and until recently it felt like a niche to me. I have been interested in forestry for quite a long time. My master's project, I was studying climate adaptation within, commercial forestry. And I kind of by chance, I started speaking with a forestry grad student at UC Berkeley. His name's Alejandro Anasal, and he told me about prescribed fire events that are open to the public. So without having had a background in fire at all, I just started going to these open public events as a volunteer. And this thing happened to me that happens to a lot of people, which is I felt absolutely carried away by its beauty. And I was surprised as someone who's cared about ecology for a long time, but kind of thought that my role was to like leave no trace. I was surprised that by practicing fire, I was part of this active practice of stewardship. And, people who get to burn things are returning this fire to plants and wildlife that evolved with it. And we're also following the lead of indigenous land stewards and returning a valuable set of tools to the toolkit of ecological restoration.
Alyssa, what are your next steps, either your research or in your career?
Yeah, so I think for my research, focusing still on this project and figuring out, again, going back to that output, what can we create that's significant to the industry? This project that I've been working on for CLIMAS is part of a larger grant where all of the field data I collected have gone into a risk tool. So we have this tool developed. It's a website that growers can go onto. They can customize different factors, and it gives them that an output to help them with scientific justification. But now it's figuring out how does that app or that website actually look? What are the different customization things that go in there? what outputs are important to growers. And it goes back to that concept of incorporating them into the conversation and trying to figure out what their needs are and how this app can really fit that. In terms of overall career, I'm moving on to some other projects now, not related specifically to those field trials I did, but still in the realm of water and fresh produce food safety. Again, trying to just find those gaps of where science exists and where growers are having challenges in the field, and being able to implement that with some research that represents real world conditions and is very useful for them.
Super cool. Um, Opening it up to the three of you again, what advice would you give to someone that wants to do environmental research in collaboration with the community?
I think the first step really is, of course, identifying that community. Who are you trying to target? Who are you trying to work with? And then get meetings and trust and collaboration built amongst them. I've mentioned this, in lots of the meetings we've had as a group that when we come in as graduate students, we often see those relationships and trust already built. At least I did. All of the industry members and the growers that I worked with, my PI has had long-standing relationships with. So I kind of got to jump in and it was already there. I had people to talk to and collaborations, and it's easy to take that for granted because I didn't see any of the work building up to that. But I think recognizing that it does take a lot of work and time and trust to build those aspects, and it's not going to happen overnight. So you kind of have to set yourself up to do community-based research and then work your way into it. You can't jump in right away to your community and say, I'm going to do this research and this is how it's going to impact you and those. You got to have those conversations.
I would say I second that entirely. I would say the other thing for me, because a lot of the work that I do ends up being in what we call environmental justice communities, or communities that have been like historically neglected by either research or state and federal guidance. I have had to learn that me going into these spaces, sometimes there is institutional distrust from people. And so that relationship building is the bare minimum requirement of making sure that the partnership is actually successful and we're actually getting people the answers to things that they want to know. And then also understanding that in my brain, when I enter spaces, I am just this, fun-loving, whimsy kind of person that shows up and is all smiles and happy. But that I am also a researcher. And so some people in these spaces might see me very differently than how I see myself. And that's totally fine and acceptable. I'm coming from a different place than just being, a person on the street, like showing up to a community event, which I think goes back a little bit to that sort of, timeline of going from being the community member to doing the research that I've had to kind of deal with and like adjust to. So I would say for anybody who wants to do this work is to make sure that you're actively having communications, bi-directional communication specifically, and that you're really taking a moment to like identify who you're working with, what are the historical contexts of the communities that you're in, and then also understanding who you are as a person and, kind of recognizing any potential biases that you might have or trying to understand how a community might interact with you coming from somewhere like a research institution.
I think that if anyone's in my boat of not entering into an existing lab or, longstanding project, the thing that was important to me was having a lot of time and um, having a lot of time to meet people and explore possibilities. It was really important in my research trajectory to be able to learn about possible projects, sometimes walk away from projects that weren't the right fit, and spend some time as a humble volunteer and participant before presuming that I needed to do research there. And being okay if, an initial idea actually didn't need me as a researcher, maybe somewhere else did.
Yeah, you've all hit on some real key points for doing some collaborative research, trust, that back and forth iterativity, building in that time to build these relationships and real solid relationships is just the building block, the bottommost foundation of doing this work. And I think that was a real theme that we've seen come up through all of your research. And yeah, thinking about you yourself as a person and as a researcher in community, and what does that mean, and what does that look like, and how does that affect the relationship? I'm really happy that you all were able to have those experiences during this year and during your larger dissertation work, and that it sounds like it'll continue in the future. And so, yeah, to wrap up, I just want to thank you for all of the amazing work that you've done over the past year with us and for sharing your insight and experiences with us today. Are there any final thoughts or words that you want to share with folks?
I just want to thank you, Gigi and Christina, for, guiding us through this fellowship and kind of bringing us together throughout the year to talk about different things. That was one of my most unexpected things of this fellowship was getting to see the impact of the other fellows. I wasn't expecting it. You kind of apply to something not really knowing what it might look like throughout the year. So I really enjoyed getting to be surrounded by people who are also doing community-based research, and it really brought me passion and like rejuvenation to keep doing this work, as you'll find impact in places you don't expect.
Yeah, a huge thank you to Gigi and Christina and the CLIMAS program. I think this program has really been extremely helpful to offer mentorship and support and kind of show grad students who are embarking on our careers that we can have it, that there is a space for important work like this.
Yeah, I second that. And I think for me, the like broader thing that comes to my brain is that if by any chance there's somebody listening that wants to go to grad school or wants to do research or just wants to be in science or any other field and they want to do it and they're like, they don't know if they can, I can guarantee you that you can do it. I think working with everybody else, all the other fellows in this project, and even, working with my community specifically, I think something that I've kind of learned to highlight for people is that, if you have a dream, it will actually come true eventually. You just have to do it. And so that's my throw out into the wind, just by chance, by happenstance.
Yeah, hopefully all of those folks are listening and will take your good advice.
And just from my end, huge thanks to all the three of you for sharing your time and engaging with each other and opening up in your successes and your challenges. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to all the listeners for joining us to learn more about the Environment Society Fellows and the work they're doing to address environmental challenges in thoughtful and collaborative ways. You can learn more about their work and experiences on the CLIMAS website at climas.arizona.edu, or you can find blog posts and a fun video and just dive into more of the details about the work that everyone's doing. Thank you. Thank you all.